Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of what we're calling Sacred Conversations. I am Steve Youngkite, and I am incredibly privileged to be joined this week by Ned and Constance Sublette. The past several weeks have had a lot of us reaching for our James Baldwins, or Michael Eric Dysons, our Robin DiAngelos, or our Ibrahim Kendis in order to make sense of the tortured racial past and present of the United States. We need to be reading those books as we grapple with white supremacy, with police violence, with inequality, and so much more right now. But I found myself reaching for another book written by Ned and Constance, this huge tome called The American Slave Coast, a book that tells a largely unacknowledged story about the United States and the practice of slave breeding in the antebellum United States. It amounts to an alternative history of our country, one that I believe we need to face into if we're ever going to stand a chance of building a more just and equitable future. And so I asked Ned and Constance if they'd be willing to share a conversation about the book in this space. And Ned and Constance, I am so grateful, so thankful that you said yes. And I'm so glad to be able to talk with you today. Now, Ned is a polymath. He has had a career as a recording musician, as a songwriter, as a record producer, and as an author of a number of books on Cuba and Cuban music, as well as New Orleans and its music. And these days, he's leading journeys to Cuba and to other parts of the world, connecting music, religion, and history within what he calls post-Mambo studies. I was privileged to be on one of those journeys to Cuba this past January, just before the coronavirus shut the world down. And it may have been one of the most transformative journeys I've ever been a part of. I've said prior to this that if there was one person I could choose to study with right now, it would be Ned Sublette. And I am pleased to say that I've been able to do just that for the past year or so. More than that, however, Ned has become a trusted friend and advisor. And so, Ned, thank you for being a part of this conversation. Constance, meanwhile, is a retired science fiction and fantasy author. She's also a retired librarian, and these days she's a freelance historian who has read her way through more archives, I suspect, than I can even imagine. And The American Slave Coast is just as much her book as it is Ned's, and just as much her vision. And so, Constance, I want you to know how honored I am to be able to share in this conversation with you as well. So thank you to both of you for being a part of this. Why don't we just begin by having me ask you how are the two of you? How are you getting by in this period of COVID-19? I know it has thrown a wrench into your business, Ned, with Post Mambo Studies.
It completely vaporized my business.
Yeah.
I have no business. We
Right.
can't travel. That's it. And it's unlikely that anyone will be calling me for my side hustle of teaching since university budgets are imploding.
Yeah.
So I'm hanging out at home, waiting a few years until I can get my business running again. And in the meantime, I'm editing movies that
Yeah.
I shot in Cuba.
Yeah.
In January, as you know, because you were with us, we went to 14 Bembe's, sacred parties for the gods, in 8 days in Cuba. And we brought filmmaker Lily Keeber and shot a lot of it on 4K video, and I've been editing that. I also have a Roomba festival that we produced in Havana
Yeah.
in November 2008. November 2018 it was.
Yeah.
And I'm editing that, so that'll keep me for a few months. I've had to learn video editing. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Just trying to avoid the Rona, stay in, and which is a problem because I want to be out. I especially want to be out. I've been demonstrating for 50 years. These
Yeah.
demonstrations that are going on now are beautiful. I want to be in them. I don't feel it's the responsible thing for me to be doing.
Yeah.
But it's my heart is out there in the street right now. So it's frustrating to stay home, but it's also beautiful to stay home with Constance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've been together for 45 years. During the entire time, she's had a book in her hand, pretty much. So, she's got a book in her hand right now. It's one we wrote.
Yeah, that's right. It's called The American Slave Coast.
The American, she's got a copy of the American Slave Coast right now in her lap. But the I've learned so much from her, and our reading is structured, and we've just been reading and reading and reading and reading. Reading has kept us sane.
Yeah.
I'll yield the floor to Constance.
Yeah, Constance, tell me about COVID-19 for you. Tell me about this period for you.
Cooking,
Cooking. All right.
shopping,
Yeah.
cleaning obsessively. I don't want to share my apartment with mice.
Yeah.
You know, talking to Ned, and actually, we've been really fortunate in our circumstances. Even though the apartment is very small, so it needs an enormous amount of attention all the time, but still, where we are located and everything else that's been going on compared to enormous numbers of people in the world,
Yeah.
we've been really privileged.
That's right. That's right. Just to place the two of you, I don't know, yeah, folks, everybody out there who might be listening, New York City. So you're in a hot spot for COVID, but yes, I think it's worth acknowledging the incredible privilege that
we're in the same little apartment where we went through the AIDS crisis 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Where we went through 9/11 and everything
And
else.
Katrina.
And Katrina from a distance. We were right here watching it on the screen and talking to people, sort of being a command post from here.
Yeah.
This is our place. This is, I mean, you defend your home by living in it, is what I learned during 9/11.
Interesting. Yeah.
And a lot of people fled the city. We haven't.
Yep. Yep. Well, it's good to know the two of you are out there and doing okay. I've thought about you a number of times throughout this crisis, and wondered and hoped that both of you were well, but it's good to see you're well, and I'm glad about that. I'm glad about that. One of the things, Ned, that I love are your email updates, and I know you've been a little bit quiet over the past couple of months throughout COVID, and it's led me to go, man, I hope they're okay. But it's good to know. Good to know you're okay. Why don't we get into the content of the book itself a little bit, and let's talk about the genesis of the American Slave Coast. Ned, I know one of the concluding chapters of your book, The World That Made New Orleans, had to do with slave breeding, and you talked a little bit about Thomas Jefferson's role in that. I'm wondering, did you have a sense while you were writing that chapter that this was going to turn out to be an entire book?
At some point, yes. There's a chapter in The World That Made New Orleans called The Slave Breeding Industry.
Right.
What made New Orleans is, among other things, an account of the making of Afro-Louisiana in its various layers, which accompanied different colonial regimes. Louisiana had 3 different colonial regimes within the span of 50 years. France, Spain, France again very briefly, and the United States. And in each of these, the regimes were very different. And with the coming of the United States to Louisiana, an enormous number of enslaved people were trafficked down from the upper South, a really large number. And as I was working on The World That Made New Orleans, it occurred to me that this story has not been told for a modern reader.
Yep.
And it was time to do it.
Yep.
And I was fortunate enough to be able to get a fellowship at Washington College at the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. And we went to Maryland for a year, without which we could not have done this. We really needed to spend on the ground in Chesapeake to comprehend, not just to have access to the data, but to understand what that society was about and what it brought to it. And I got the grant on the strength of my previous work and the application I put in. But I immediately, my joke is I proposed to Constance again. I said, you know, would you be my co-author? And she said yes. So we spent the academic year of 2010/11, 10 years ago already. Oh my God, in a house, an 18th century house in small town in Maryland with a fantastic library in the house, just reading, taking notes, writing nonstop for a year. And that's what enabled us to make enough headway to get this book rolling.
Yep. Yep.
But also really important was the geography.
Mm.
This is the heartland of the War of 1812, which brought us Andrew Jackson as president, which
Right.
had such a great effect, particularly on the slave reading industry.
Yes, yes, yes. So yeah, Maryland and Virginia obviously play a huge role in the story that you tell. So being able to locate in Chestertown and to learn that whole geography, or relearn perhaps, I imagine was incredibly important in learning this material. So talk to me about, so Constance, what were your feelings about being brought on as a co-author? I mean, this is the first time I think that you've written or published a book together, to my knowledge anyway. So how did that work, and how did the division of labor unfold?
Well, it worked a lot in the same way that the other books that either of us had published before worked.
Yeah.
We're each other's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th readers.
Yeah.
Ned is a brilliant editor as
Uh-huh.
well as a brilliant writer.
Yeah.
So it worked very much that way, passing material back and forth.
Yeah.
And also because I realized Andrew Jackson and the War of 1812 have been deep interests of mine for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I realized even during The World That Made New Orleans being written and so on, what a role he had played. So this was an incredible opportunity to really dig in and begin to understand what made all of that. And then the effect of making an Andrew Jackson presidency, and also our loss in the War of 1812 pretty much, although John Quincy Adams did pull it out in a certain kind of way in the treaty negotiations. Still, it was an incredible opportunity for me to learn something that I really didn't know and wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, my previous books, Constance is gratefully acknowledged in the acknowledgments because, of course, many ideas that I have were things that I used to call her my history teacher because of the aforementioned intensive reading program that's gone on our entire lives together.
Yep.
And there are things in my previous books that, including occasional utterances that came out of her mouth and were written directly down. But this was time for a I wrote those books. Those were my books. We did not write them together as a joint project, but this one was reconceived as a joint project because this subject was
Yeah.
that it was really going to need two of us
Yes.
to process it all. And indeed we did. The division of labor, I was the drafter, and Constance was sort of the lead scout on research. I'm like back there banging out a chapter about Jefferson, and she's already 30 years in the future saying, hey, you got to get with Andrew Jackson here.
Jackson, yeah. We'll talk about these figures a little bit as we move through the conversation. I do want to talk about Jefferson, and I want to talk about Jackson and John Quincy Adams, who was one of the only folks that comes out looking kind of good in this narrative. He seems to be a person of conscience. He's somebody about whom I know relatively little. So I was grateful to learn more about him. But certainly Jefferson and Jackson, I learned a great deal that hadn't been taught to me. But let's talk a little bit about the title itself, the American Slave Coast. What do you mean by that? What is the American Slave Coast? And obviously we think about the African Slave Coast. What's the American Slave Coast, and what does that denote for the two of you?
Europeans named various parts of the African coast after its products: the Ivory Coast,
Yep.
The Slave Coast.
Yes.
Of course, there were more places that produced slaves in Africa than just the part named the Slave Coast.
Yep.
But the basic idea of speaking of the American Slave Coast, the phrase refers to the Chesapeake specifically, because more slave ships came to New Orleans from the east coast of the United States than from Africa.
Interesting. Yep. So it was this export business that was every bit as evil as what was coming from Africa, the importation that was coming from Africa, and the volume was every bit as great.
Oh, it was greater.
Greater.
Much
Greater.
bigger.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The numbers are really important to understand.
Exactly. Yeah. Go ahead.
The United States and its colonial predecessor territories took relatively few Africans. I think a lot of people don't understand how few Africans were brought here. The best number we have for the number of Africans who arrived here alive is 389,000.
Yep.
This number is not known with precision. It might have been more, but it wasn't a multiple. The best estimate is 389,000, which is less than 4% of the hemispheric total.
Yeah.
Barbados, which is the size of Queens, took more Africans than the entire United States.
Yep.
Right? So fewer than 400,000 Africans were brought here, yet by 1860, there were 4 million enslaved African Americans.
Yep.
In a sense, our entire book is about unpacking that number.
Yep. Yep. Ned, do we know? So formally, we can say that the slave breeding era began after 1808, and I want to get into that, the importance of that date in just a second. But do we know precisely what the numbers were at, say, 1808? We know that by 1865 there were some 4 million. We know that 389,000 or so were imported. But what were the numbers? How do we know the precise, or can we guess with any precision about how many folks were bred in this way?
Well, not exactly. I don't think I can give you a straight answer on that. We know the number of 4 million was actually 3,900,000 because there was a census in 1860.
Got it.
Perhaps that undercounted slightly,
Yep.
but it's probably a pretty good number. There wasn't a census in 1808. There were censuses, but how many people were born into slavery in the colonial and in the Republican United States, I can't give you a number.
Yep. Okay.
But millions.
But
Yep.
the thing is that by the time of the War of Independence, and even before that, almost all of the Africans who arrived here directly from Africa were already here.
Yeah. Yeah.
The War of Independence would also have stopped the slave imports from Africa, but soon after the establishment of the United States and the Constitution, which we'll get into,
Yep.
it had stopped, and there were good reasons for this.
Yep.
There were a couple of bubbles of importation posterior to independence in Georgia and South Carolina. And in particular, South Carolina went on a buying spree of kidnapped Africans in the years in the years leading up to January 1st, 1808, knowing that the African slave trade would be prohibited by then. So in 1806, 1807, the numbers of Africans coming in are disproportionately big. Georgia had also imported Africans. Georgia is the only territory that I believe that imported more Africans after independence than before.
Interesting.
But by and large, the people in 1808, the black people in the United States were not African born.
Right. All right, so let's talk about what you mean by slave breeding, and what that connotes. I mean, I think a lot of people, this is a concept that for many people will be rather new. So what are we talking about with the slave breeding industry? Let's talk specifically about that.
Well, we could start with what it was not.
Okay.
It was not plantations dedicated to the raising of fatherless children to be put up for sale. Many reasons for that beyond the fact it's just impractical.
Right.
Not the way we can do babies.
Right.
Get them ready in a profitable way for the time they become profitable to be able to do a full day's work and so on. So it didn't work like that at all. We cannot find any evidence for such an establishment at all.
Right.
What it was more like harvesting, as children that were born into slavery came online, shall we say, as profitable workers, enabled themselves to reproduce.
Yeah.
And everyone who had an enslaved woman who could bear children could be involved in this.
Right.
Each child that is born creates another entry into the profit side of your account book.
Yes.
At the moment of birth.
Yep.
There may have been attempts at creating those mythical baby farms, but it was not how the industry worked. As Constance said, it was more like harvesting. Every farm that had slaves was a slave breeding farm.
Yes. Yes.
The term is abhorrent, I should note, and used it in the subtitle with some reluctance. But it has the advantage that everybody understands what you're talking about. And it was commonly used at the time. There are a number of references from many of the major figures of American history to slave breeding, to Virginia being a slave breeding state, and in the slavery business itself, the term breeder was used. It's an awful term. But that was what it was, a system that financialized the birth of human beings.
Right. Well, let's go into a little bit about 1808 and the importance of that date. Ned, I've heard you say that is one of, if not the single most important date in the history of the United States, January 1st, 1808. What does that signify? What is it? What's at stake in January 1st, 1808? What happens then?
January 1st, 1808 is the date specified in the United States Constitution, the only date in the Constitution before which the federal government could not prohibit importation of persons, was the term used. Right. And the Constitution didn't say that importation of persons had to stop January 1st, 1808, said it could not be prohibited before then. This was put into the Constitution at the insistence of the delegates from South Carolina,
Right.
who wanted a 20-year guarantee that slave importation could continue. However, it did happen that way because Jefferson, who was president in 1806, asked in his annual message to Congress, asked to have a prohibition on importation of persons at the earliest possible constitutionally permissible moment. So as of January 1st, 1808, the African slave trade was prohibited by federal law. And by and large, that prohibition was enforced. There was a kind of a clandestine traffic, especially to the Gulf region, the Gulf Coast, in the 10 years or so after that. But it was not convenient for the slave power to have importation of Africans because they were making so much money out of their domestic business of slave breeding.
Yes. Yeah.
Jefferson's Virginia constituents became fabulously much more wealthy on paper once the slave trade from Africa was prohibited. Suddenly, they had the most valuable commodity in America.
Well, more to the point, though, also, is that with the number of enslaved labor that they had on their account books, the more they had, the larger their credit,
Yep.
which meant that they could buy all the things in England or from the North that they did not construct or have in the states that had a strong slave labor force. So right there, it was good. Because by then already, by 1808, even by the War of Independence, the land in Virginia in the old Upper South was wearing out for their cash crop of tobacco. And of course, cotton did not come in until a little later after that.
Interesting.
So, and they were not the best states for cotton anyway.
Yeah.
That comes later. But with this, everybody could still live as a gentleman on their plantation. The force of workers would continue to do all the work that a plantation needed. The young ones are being trained up into the professions, whether they were an artisanal class or working in the house or working in the fields. They spoke English. They were probably Protestant in religion. The best brand for sale. And it meant that people could still live just as well as if they were selling tobacco in large amounts for a great deal of cash. And they still tried, but this was always there. The labor force was always there to monetize, to put in your pocket if you needed to have an expensive wedding, whatever.
In 1808, when the change was made by federal law, this marks the beginning of a whole new era in American history. And I think we need to periodize it that way. Much has been made this in the last year of the date 1619. But we would argue that 1808 is as important a date and leads us to a radical vision of what American history was.
Yep. All right, so let's talk about what actually transpired in 1808. You talk about the arrangement being really an interstate rivalry in the South between, on one hand, Virginia and Maryland, and South Carolina on the other. So what's the arrangement that's put into place as of 1808?
I've never seen a book that says this. I'm really proud that we were able to tell this story.
Yeah.
It's real clear if you read the contemporary documentation what was going on. Virginia was the great slave breeder. Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake.
Yep.
Carolina and the Low Country were the great slave importer.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the specializations from earliest times. And people forget how much history there was already by the time of American independence. By that time, slave breeding was already baked into the economy of Virginia. There was no way that a man like Patrick Henry could climb down from owning large numbers of slaves without impoverishing himself.
Right. So, yeah, I think it's amazing that this, it's amazing that this story hasn't been told, or hasn't been told well. I mean, this, to my knowledge anyway, this is the first book that actually tells the story of this interstate rivalry, which kind of puts 1808 as the kind of key fundamental date. I don't know. Yeah, are there any other documents that do this prior to the American slave coast?
I mean, there are books. I mean, a slave counterpoint talks about the difference in specialization between Chesapeake and Carolina. It's a very important book. But I think people there's a tendency to think of the South as this one entity, and it was anything but.
Yeah.
It was multiple power centers. South Carolina saw itself as the rightful autocrats of the entire hemisphere. South Carolina was the one that made the trouble at the Constitutional Convention. South Carolina was the one that threatened to take their toys and go home. And South Carolina was the one that for decades incited the other southern states to secede until finally, beginning in 1860, they did. South Carolina was always went its own way and in determined and belligerent opposition to what anyone else wanted, most definitely including Virginia a lot of the time. And you could see this rivalry playing itself out at the Constitutional Convention.
Why don't we talk about the Constitutional Convention a little bit, and why don't we talk about the Constitution, because this whole arrangement is really baked into the Constitution itself. So what happens at the Constitution to kind of set the stage for this later development as of 1808, this later interstate rivalry that's gonna transpire? How does this get baked into the very fabric of the founding of the United States? What are the elements at play in the Constitution?
Well, Virginia was the largest and the wealthiest state.
Yep.
And Virginia wasn't going to do anything that compromised the sanctity of property and people.
Yeah.
South Carolina, however, had a different agenda that did not include necessarily being part of a cooperative nation. 13 states.
Right.
If they did not see themselves as being a state, one of 13 states, they saw themselves as being the state.
Yeah.
But at the Constitutional Convention, David Waldstreicher's book, Slavery's Constitution, is the book I always refer to people to. It's a very concise and cogent accounting of all the places in the Constitution where the Constitution favors slavery. And as Waldstreicher wrote on another occasion, hardwired it into the U.S. government.
Yep.
To the government of this new nation that the Constitution brought into existence. The whether it's the infamous 3/5 clause or the 20-year guarantee for the slave trade can continue.
Yep.
I should point out that when the slave trade was prohibited, there was definitely an attempt to spin it as a humanitarian act.
Yep.
Nobody liked the slave trade from Africa. It was a horrible business. Thomas Jefferson could feel good about stopping it, but it was not a humanitarian act. Stopping slavery would have been the humanitarian act. And slavery continued for another 55 years.
Yes.
Stopping the prohibition against the African slave trade was protectionism.
Mm.
It protected the more expensive human product against the cheaper foreign imports.
Mm.
And this is also in response to a previous question about Virginia versus South Carolina, because they were on opposite sides of this question.
Right. Let's get into Thomas Jefferson, because he's so important in kind of building this sort of architecture of slave breeding. He's one of the people that uses that term. But Ned, I've heard you talk about Thomas Jefferson as one of the great villains of American history from the perspective of African Americans, of Black people. So he's been so lionized as a founding father. He's been just as a hero of our country. Let's talk a little bit more honestly about Jefferson. Why is he a villain?
Ask John Quincy Adams.
All right.
Right? I should mention, in terms of Adams, before answering the Jefferson question, you want to know more about John Quincy Adams, a truly interesting figure. The previously mentioned David Waldstreicher edited a Library of America edition of his diaries. Adams is one of the most, probably, I think, the most important American diarist, and created a great work of literature in his diary, which he kept from, I think, when he was 12 until he died.
Yeah.
And his the 2 volumes published from Library of America, David Waldstreicher said he guessed it was between 10 and 20% of the total amount. Is vast. No one, I don't think anyone's read it all, although I guess someone has. I guess David Waldstreicher had to. But in handwriting, there's no complete published transcript of the entire diary, although the Massachusetts Historical Society has made all of the manuscript available online, and you can find it if you have the patience to deal with the handwriting. But I mean, read Adams every time in his later years, every time Jefferson's name comes up, he uses words like deceitful. Jefferson is somebody that is the more you know about him, the harder it is to defend him, I think. And I don't mean as he chose to portray himself, but I mean, look at the actual record of his positions and his actions as involving African Americans. And he does not come off well at all. He was in favor of, in his entire life, he believed that the only way to get rid of slavery would be to ethnically cleanse the country of every Black person. He wanted to deport them all. A vision which we have seen horrifically resurrected in the modern era with someone like Stephen Miller. This idea of purifying the country ethnically.
Yes.
That's Jefferson.
That's Jefferson, yeah.
Jefferson wanted to, until the country had removed the people whom it was assumed could not live peacefully together with white people. Until that happened, as Jefferson said, we have the wolf by the ears, and we cannot let him go. Until that happened, slavery could not end, and which of course meant that all the slave owners of Virginia would just have to continue being rich, owning other people as human beings.
Yep.
Beyond that, though, even in what I suppose looking at something nationally, in his personal life, he revealed himself as a very mean person.
Mm.
For example, in his account book, women who no longer could give birth, even if they had provided something like 10, 12 children over the years that he had them or with them, next to her name, or whatever she was called, actually a lot of them were just numbers, was written without value.
Oh, well.
He halved the ration for food. People who no longer could put in a full day's work.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, that's the kind of person he was.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talk about at one point a scheme that he had of not only deportation, yes, but separating children from their newborn children from their mothers and deporting them in particular.
Yes, that was his ethnic cleansing plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sell the Western lands,
Yep.
use the proceeds to compensate slave owners, and buy all the children and ship them out.
Yeah.
Which would have required a totalitarian government to implement, and which would have, of course, had a terrible mortality rate had it been attempted.
Right. Right. And then rationalized with the notion that the enslaved perhaps didn't have feelings in the same way.
And as he wrote about, what Notes on the State of Virginia is a founding document of white supremacy in America. He's one of the fundamental theorists of white supremacy. Period.
Yep. Which makes it no accident that those.
I find him very difficult to defend.
Yep.
And he is the single most problematic figure in confronting our own racist heritage as a country. I think he's the most problematic figure. Ultimately, we can say that Robert E. Lee was a traitor. That's pretty simple. The guys who left the United States became generals fighting for slavery. We are now, as a nation, in a way we haven't in a long time, standing up and saying that this was wrong. Jefferson is a lot harder because, of course, he is the author of the Declaration of Independence,
Right.
which is revered as a sacred document.
Right.
As a president, he was a terrible president. His 2 terms as president, his great coup was the Louisiana Purchase, which, of course, guaranteed the success of the slave breeding industry by giving all this new territory to expand slavery into.
Right.
I understand that the pattern by which the slave breeding industry worked was that first Virginia had an oversupply of enslaved labor for the amount of plantation work at hand. So the most profitable thing to do was to sell the surplus labor. This is all about surplus. The surplus labor into new territories that were and there were going to be new territories coming online for as long as any of those people could imagine.
Right.
And first Kentucky, first, et cetera, then into Tennessee, then on down. There was a conversion cycle. The hardest work was clearing the land, pulling up the stumps, making it usable for agriculture. But once that had happened, then, and once the enslaved were reproducing, there was more labor than work to do. So the slave breeding industry required continual expansion of the market and drove the expansion of the United States. That's what the annexation of Texas was about.
Yep.
Right?
Getting a new market.
Mere rumor of Texas coming online for plantation agriculture as part of the United States. It was, for a slave owner, it was like having their Apple shares triple in value suddenly.
Yeah.
Suddenly their portfolio of enslaved laborers became worth much, much more. And the central fact of all of this that we haven't mentioned yet, that it's really important to understand, is that in the antebellum South, and particularly in the Jacksonian era, people were the money. People were the money. Slaves were human savings accounts. Cotton was hot cash flow. But once profit from a cotton crop was realized, it had to be locked down. And there were no reliable banks. There was no federal currency. There were no greenbacks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew Jackson.
We'll get to him in just a few minutes.
Well,
but keep going.
we're getting to him already. But
Yeah.
but the bottom line here is that people were the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that money was worth more as the market for slaves improved, protecting the value of enslaved property. And this goes right back to the Constitutional Convention. Protecting the value of enslaved property was slave owners' number one, number two, and number three priority, all the way back to the founding of Virginia.
Right.
Which also includes why they were so crazy starting even before the War of Independence to annex Cuba. This has been a dream of the South for a very long time. And after the Constitution, after we became a nation, it meant, and then particularly in the Jacksonian era, if Cuba could be annexed with that protectionist clause in the Constitution of no importation of slaves from Africa after 1808, that meant all of Cuba was a market for their enslaved labor.
Right.
And Cuba doing sugar, which chewed up the average person's life in 10 years or less, was just the market to die for. It would be like, people wanting China as their market for products now. And it would also mean that we would have at least 2 more pro-slave senators to help continue the protectionism and the effect of a slavery economy. Because, of course, we had 2 competing economies already by the 20s, the 30s, and the 1840s. The going into industrial, mercantile kind of economy that was the North, and we had the capitalist slavocracy economy of the South. They were both capitalist, but they were competing economic systems, and they were of the kind that competed in a certain kind of way that they could not continue to coexist. One or the other had to be dominant, and at this point, the slave economy was a real drag on the development of the Northern industrial economy.
But it was larger. The South, slave owners in the South were not simply wealthy. They were spectacularly wealthy. They were the mega rich. And their value was mostly in human bodies, which had a value in the ledger that rendered that once that value was gone, once slavery was no longer in effect, their entire worth just went. They had only the land left, and the land at that time was worthless, though it ultimately would be the foundations of new fortunes continuing into the 21st century. But the fact of value being ascribed, a monetary value being ascribed to people as property, distorted the American economy so greatly that nothing really could happen until it was over.
And partly that was also because with the economy, that kind of slave economy, with all of the value put into human beings, you could not buy anything outside of that bubble of that economy.
Mm-hmm.
That property mattered only as credit in the North, somebody giving value to that property in the North, but you could not bring a person to a carriage manufacturer and buy a carriage with that person. Now, if they'd happened to have had carriage manufacturers in the South, you probably could. You could pay debts with actual human beings.
Hmm.
You could do all kinds of financial transactions with actual human beings in the South. But
Like Monticello.
yes, but you could not do that in the North.
So
Yeah.
there was
Or in Europe.
So there was this extremely valuable property that was only good in this one of two economic regions.
Yeah, yeah. Now, since we're talking a little bit about Cuba, we know that most of the exports from Baltimore went to South Carolina, New Orleans, but we know that some went to Cuba and Brazil too. Is that right?
Well, not like that exactly.
Okay.
It wasn't so much that the human product of the Upper South was sold in Cuba and Brazil, because that's not what happened.
Okay.
And I just shudder when I use a phrase like human product, but we're talking in the cold language of business here.
Yeah.
What did happen was that the only African slave trade that could continue, which was to Cuba and Brazil, was done under the U.S. flag.
I see.
Or by pirates, because Britain committed to stopping the African slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
And Britain would stop and search slave ships on the high seas. Britain forced the end of the slave trade to Brazil finally in 1850.
Mm.
But as a result of the War of 1812 and the treaty that ended it, Britain could not stop U.S. flagged ships. So the Baltimore shipyards made a great amount of money building vessels that were used by people in the African slave trade. They also, but those vessels ran very often with a stars and stripes above them.
I see.
Even though they were not necessarily American ships with American crews and captains, but because they were the flag that could pass. And that's an extensive story that brought many large numbers of enslaved people to Cuba and Brazil in the 19th century after the slave trade had theoretically stopped.
It also really helped enrich certain Southerners who happened to have the post in Havana as the U.S. Minister. He would facilitate and basically selling the American flag to whatever ship we're going to buy it.
Specifically Nicholas Trist.
Yes.
But it also, the numbers of people brought, we don't even know, because of course this was all basically, this was not necessarily logged. This was clandestine trade, right? This vast slave trade to Cuba that went on was clandestine, and it only stopped with the U.S. Civil War. Mm. That's what finally stopped this traffic. And it was after in the 1860s is when slave ships stopped coming to Cuba.
Okay. All right. So let's get into Jackson. Let's get into Jackson. He's one of the other principal figures that moves throughout this story that you tell. He has the distinction, you note, of being the only American president to have himself actually driven a coffle across land. We know,
No,
as far as we know.
it's unlikely that any others did because Jackson was the one who was of that class. The previous presidents, none of them had been of the class, the lower class that engaged in the crudity of slave trading.
Yeah.
That was a different social level.
Yep.
And that was Jackson. Jackson was a slave trader.
Mm.
Andrew Jackson was a slave trader.
Yep.
Period.
Period,
He was a merchant that took slaves along with other merchandise from Tennessee down south, down to Natchez. Martin Van Buren didn't trade slaves. The subsequent presidents, as far as we know, did not. James Polk bought and sold slaves clandestinely from the White House while he was president to try to fatten his nest egg.
So Jackson comes to us with that particular, that's his origin story in many ways.
Yeah, as well, and just as much as his origin story is hatred of the British for what they did to his family in the War of Independence, and also particularly as an Indian fighter.
Yep.
Which then made that whole Louisiana territory safe for the expansion of plantation slavery.
Yep.
And when he conquered West Florida, that made solid South safe for plantation slavery.
Right. So this is something that continues throughout his career. I think you say basically lasted even through his presidency. I mean, clearing this, ethnically cleansing that region in order to make it safe for slavery, right?
Oh, well, of course, Indian removal.
Yeah.
Frontiers.
Yep.
This is what we know Jackson for.
Yep.
But it is intrinsically and intimately entwined with plantation slavery. In every possible way. His efforts in so many ways, including his war against the bank, to create cheap land that anyone could buy to clear with the bodies of enslaved labor. They're all just, it wouldn't have happened without his driving passion of hatred for the British, which also helped drive his wars in the Floridas, his determination to get rid of the bank. I still haven't quite completely figured out what really drove that. I mean, I know that he lost a lot of money due to the first bank. And of course, then to get rid of the Indians so that we could create ultimately Dixie.
Yep.
Jackson hated paper money.
Yes.
And did everything he could to keep the United States from having a sound national fiscal policy. He drove the car off the cliff. He cranked it up and threw the brakes away. He was not only was he his personal popularity, his great capacity to hate, and his autocratic nature and his utter corruption. Jackson's administration was not only corrupt, but set in place a corrupt system that continued until Lincoln.
Yeah.
When in the 1850s, if the federal government spent money, it still had to go get gold and put it in a wagon and drive it across Washington to the other part of town to spend it. There was not a system of national paper money. There were only all of these whack banks, which might or might not go out of business next year. Paper money was their paper. The banks issued their own money. And to spend paper money in another city would be like doing a foreign exchange transaction today. It was very complicated. The one safe play for money was to own an enslaved human being, because in every era, the most easily liquidatable asset was a slave. There was always a robust market waiting to buy enslaved human beings.
Due to Jackson's financial policies, or financial insanity, we could even call it, I'm sure John Quincy Adams did, it meant that we had panic after panic financially that hit the whole country, supposedly, except that the ruling elite in the South, which owned the largest number of enslaved labor, were pretty much insulated from that. There is only one panic, I believe, in which, for a very short time, the value of the enslaved fell. But very shortly, it rebounded, and it rebounded even higher, as it did each time.
And of course, Jackson's policies came to a head. Reminds me a little bit of the way we had this almost economic collapse in this country at the end of 2 terms of George W. Bush, right? Which then President Obama had to deal with. This happened with Martin Van Buren, who had just been president for a matter of months when the Panic of 1837 erupted, the most severe economic downturn in American history until the Great Depression, which was really a consequence of many things. There's a book called the Panic, what is the Many Panics of 1830, MANY, Panics of 1837, when all the banks in New Orleans failed in a chain reaction. All of this because there was, at this point, not a stable financial infrastructure for the United States. After Jackson had willfully destroyed the one that was there.
What do you make of the fact that Jackson's portrait is currently hanging in the Oval Office? I don't know. What symbolism do you read there?
If you didn't know those people were up to no good when they put in the portrait of Jackson, you knew it for sure.
I don't know.
It was about hatred. It was about hatred because nobody could hate like Jackson. And Jackson was brilliant at pulling out hatred and division and destruction everywhere he went. Those were his policies. They weren't about building. They were about destruction. Everything. And the bank is just the most famous. And the destruction of the Native American tribes. Those are the famous things that he did. But he was always good at destruction and creating that kind of atmosphere. So that's certainly what I was thinking of when
I mean, rereading the chapters on Jackson, I couldn't help but think, we've seen pronouncements from the Oval Office recently having to do with George Floyd, with police brutality, and there's Andrew Jackson hanging in the background like a specter or like a ghost over the whole proceeding. It's really, really telling.
I want to say that it's been absolutely brilliant seeing the fury recently, and we're speaking in June 2020 here, as the statues and the monuments to the traitors of the Confederacy have been called into question and pulled down in one place after another. I think this is a really good moment for our country to be saying this will not stand.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. I'm with you there.
We've seen recently, the Democrats used to have something called a Democrats, the Jefferson Jackson dinner. Remember that?
Sure.
They stopped having that. Jefferson and Jackson, the two great figures of American slavery.
Yeah. Yep. 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 Okay, so we should probably start bringing this to a close somehow. It's a hard thing to bring to a close. I don't know how long we've been at it now, but you know, let's talk about how this whole system collapses. We really do know, you know, obviously it has to do with the Civil War. But what leads up to that? What is it that that generates the ultimate upheaval?
Insanity. I am quoting all of the Adamses here, whether it's John Quincy, and his grandson, Henry Adams. The word they use over and over and over is insane insanity, because they cannot make any sense of what these people are doing.
Yeah.
Of course, that's quite glib, but
but to the point, from no less than John Quincy Adams and John Adams.
There was a decades-long movement to make it happen.
Yeah.
And the idea of secession was not that the South wanted to be left alone in peace with its peculiar institutions, to have, you know, jousting tournaments on the front lawn of the plantation. They wanted to take over the United States and have an all-slavery nation. Yeah. The idea of secession was that they would be in the White House by Christmas. That was the plan. And when that didn't happen, there was no plan B.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by then, they had dug themselves up as traitors and set themselves up to be hanged. Though in the long run, that's not what happened. There was nothing to do but continue the butchery. And they had gone so far out on their limb, they had sawed the limb off. There was no climb down from having taken up arms against the government of the United States. And even after Vicksburg, the loss of Vicksburg, which was pretty much a turning point militarily, at this point it was going to be very difficult for the South to win. They would not give up.
Yep.
The leaders kept the carnage up, would not sue for peace.
Yep.
Stepped on their unacceptable terms. And this continued for all those years that we already know about. I might point out that the Trumpists started out way ahead of them because they actually took over the government in November 2016. And they now have been controlling Washington, something the Confederacy couldn't imagine. I fear what we are seeing as we approach the election of 2020 is that there's going to be a push to consolidate Trumpism before the election. And I hope I'm wrong about that. And I hope that this massive and beautiful movement of Black Lives Matter that has so blossomed in this month will be the leading edge of an even more massive popular movement. That is the only force that is capable of stopping this horrible train that is in motion.
Candace, what were you going to say there?
It just seems so unfair that once again, the United States has to save itself through the sacrifice of Black bodies,
Uh-huh.
Black well-being.
Yeah.
Because where were we white people all this time with him in the White House doing those terrible things? It wasn't until African Americans and their tremendous spiritual courage dared to go out and physically say no, that this country started, I will say, and I hope it's not too strong, just started to get off its ass.
Yep. Yep.
And just as people of color have been in the forefront of the fight against the virus, have had the most sacrifices, the most deaths, this is what's happening in this area as well. And you know, it's all entwined.
Yep. 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 Well, to say Black Lives Matter in that regard feels both necessary, but also about as minimal an affirmation of what we can say. Certainly matter, but given all the sacrifices that have been made, yeah, that seems like the least that we can say. It is a really interesting, I mean, yeah, you divide the Civil War up into these two distinct eras as you know, leading up into, you know, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and then realizing that it's not going to be possible to get into the White House. Just this era after that of utter destruction, utter chaos, just mass murder for the sake of nothing, insanity, as you say, Constance.
We say in our book is that revolutionary wars and civil wars are, in a sense, one is the other turned inside out.
Yeah.
Revolutionary wars are civil wars, and civil wars are revolutionary wars.
Yeah.
So revolutionary wars can be, don't have to go in one direction. The great moment that was the real turning point, I think, in the so-called Civil War, which was our Revolutionary War, because it got rid of slavery. Revolutionary War, so-called, Thomas Jefferson's slaves remained Thomas Jefferson's slaves. It did not revolutionize their lives.
It was a revolution about property.
It was a revolution about political systems and about property. But the so-called Civil War was a revolution. And the moment that revolution was sealed was January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And I don't mean because Lincoln declared the enslaved to be free in territories that he was not controlling at the time. I mean because the Emancipation Proclamation, besides declaring the enslaved to be free, also provided for the enlistment and arming of Black soldiers for the first time in the Union Army. And once that happened, once Black people could take up arms, slavery was killed.
That's also when we got a national currency.
Once the value of human beings was taken off the books, we got the greenback.
Wow. 1863. Yep. No, it's a really, really helpful date. So, all right, let's start to land this plane a little bit. Why do you think what should we take away from this story? You've obviously spent a lot of time laboring to tell this story. It's something that evidently a lot of folks have not wanted to face for many, many years. What do you hope to achieve, and what do you hope will happen as a result of people more and more and more, I hope, learning this history, reading this book? What would be the best outcome you could imagine?
Well, there's quite a few, but one of my earliest hopes for this book is, having spent more hours than I probably should have trying to explain to people what the Civil War really was, what slavery really is, how we got there, that it's all here from the founding or the first colonization of North America to the point through Appomattox.
Yep.
It's all here in one book,
yep.
whether it be economic, political, cultural, it's all here. It's a very big book. And then, like Donald Harrison Jr.'s mom said, it's a big book. You can hit them with
it. I love that. I love that. Yeah. Yeah, Ned, what would you say to that question? What would you hope happens as a result of this?
I would like people to have a better understanding of American history.
Yeah, yeah.
And we're telling a story that hasn't been told, and 1619 didn't tell this story. I supported the phenomenon of 1619. I certainly wasn't one of those people who piled on to it, but I feel that it wasn't radical enough. And I feel that it did not tell this story.
Yeah.
And that's, I would really like people to discover this book so that the narrative can be updated a little bit.
Yep.
We began researching this book. Well, we had been researching it anyway without knowing quite where we were going, but we formally began work on this book in 2010. Book was published in 2015. We've been doing other things in the last 5 years. I have not been working on another book. And so it's been as starting with Ferguson. This book was published just as Ferguson.
Yep.
And the Charleston massacre.
Yes.
In the church.
Yes.
In Mother Bethel. Not Mother.
Mother Emanuel.
Mother
Emanuel. Sorry. And we've been seeing these shards, these bits and pieces that we had researched in doing this come to light and start to become common knowledge.
Yeah.
Almost one tweet at a time. I mean, this book in hardcover weighs 3 pounds. It's kind of the anti-tweet. But I would really like to see more of what's in this book become common knowledge.
Yes, 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 yes. Do you think, do you think it can help us as we navigate some of the questions that we're dealing with now, some of the issues that we're dealing with now? Certainly, police brutality is on the agenda, but all sorts of things related to racial justice right now.
Well, when I teach, I tell students, you don't study history because history is going to repeat itself, or in Mark Twain's formulation, even because it rhymes, but because it's the only way we have of understanding the present.
Yeah.
The only way we can know who we are today is to know who we were yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah.
And without that, you have kind of a national Alzheimer's.
Or you also just rewrite history, which we've certainly done.
Yes.
Literally, consciously, in every way. And those statues that are coming down were put up as part of rewriting history.
Yeah.
And they were put up by the losing side. They say history is written by the winners, but in this case, when it comes to slavery and the war between the states, War of the Rebellion, it was not written by the winners at all. Although they did write, but somehow Gone with the Wind won.
Yes.
The glorious lost cause of two sides equal in chivalry and courage. And then in The Virginian by Owen Wister, Theodore Roosevelt's one of his best friends. But it all comes together when the Virginian out in Wyoming in white man's country marries the schoolmarm from Maine. And it's all over. It's all good. We all won.
Well, the invasion of Cuba in the so-called Spanish-American War was portrayed as national reconciliation between the former Union and Confederacy, as the two former sides, now much older, worked together to deny Cuban independence. The Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, was the consul in Havana who requested that the Maine be sent in.
Yeah.
There was a tremendous amount of rhetoric at the time about how at last we had achieved national reconciliation through helping Cuba. And this theme of national reconciliation, which was very, very strong in the first decades of the 20th century, was achieved at the expense of Black people who had been turned into non-persons in a way that very much inspired the Nazi project in Germany. But that's another topic.
Yes. Well, we can do that next conversation, maybe.
We'll do that later.
Yeah. I will say this. I mean, I've been up at the Capitol building in Hartford almost every day for the last 10 days. And what I'm hearing again and again and again are Black folks telling people, white folks like me, do your work about interrogating white supremacy. And I think a significant piece of that is built into the American slave coast, is undoing and untangling the white supremacy built into our history. So I am powerfully grateful to the both of you for the feat that you've accomplished in writing that book, putting it out into the world, and for continuing to talk about it and to get the story out there. I think it has everything to do with undoing the white supremacy that we inherit, that we grow up with.
If that's your takeaway from it, I'm very satisfied. That's
one takeaway
I would hope that people would get from the book. And I thank you for giving us a platform to talk about it.
Heck yeah. Can I ask one more question? I want to know, from 2010 to 2016, you were working on this book. It's some really hard, painful stuff. It's repellent material in many ways. What kept you going? What kept you moving through it? It obviously came from a deep sense of commitment within both of you that this is something that needed to be done, that had to be done, no matter how ugly.
Well, partly because being the kind of people we are, we're very curious, and so there's this tremendous satisfaction of learning things always.
Yeah.
But I do think that there were a lot of parts of it that were really hard, and in the contemporary sense, maybe the hardest part, just experience, was going to the Angola prison and driving through what you drive through to get there, which hasn't changed much since the days of the Louisiana Purchase. And realizing how Dixie, the Cotton Kingdom, after the War of 1812, became this huge, enormous, locked down prison. All of it. All of it. And just knowing that, having that experience, is something that will keep you going, as awful as it is, because that's what we need to know. It's really hard to understand that if you haven't physically been there. Just like a lot of the places that we went on our research trips made all the difference in the world.
It's a dark and depressing story. It's a depressing book. It's a depressing subject. I've had a lot of people say, I'm glad that you did the work, but I'm not going to read it.
Hmm.
So some of the chapters you really don't want to read before you go to bed at night.
No, that's right. That's right.
You don't want them turning up in your dreams.
Yep.
It was once the writing process was over and I looked back on it, I realized that there was a sort of an underlying depression going on.
Wow. Yeah.
As I was working on it, that I was sort of like tamping down. And it's a depression that we'll never be free of because this is our story.
Yep.
And to ask what kept us going, this is our history. This is our story. We have to own up to it and we have to know what it was. And we're proud to have been able to take the time, expend the resources necessary, the 5 years of our lives that it took to excavate the contours of this story and to be able to tell it and to be able to publish it. I'm very, very satisfied of the 4 books I've written. This is the most satisfying in terms of its completeness and in terms, for me, of its urgency.
That's right. Yep. Yep. It's certainly urgent. It's certainly urgent that it came out right during the moment of Ferguson, right after Ferguson, right?
Yeah, it came out. Well, we were finishing it in the summer of 2015, and it came out toward the end of the year of 15.
Yep.
And then, of course, a year later came the Trumpocalypse, and everything changed.
Right. So it couldn't be more, more timely in many ways. Couldn't be more timely. Well, listen, I want to wrap this up and just thank the both of you again for engaging in this conversation, for talking about this material, but more than that, for doing the work to get this story out. I think it is it's a volume that I hope has a long life. And I want to urge everybody to read it. So listen, thank you to both of you for all of your work on it and for engaging in the conversation now. It means a lot to me, but I know it is an incredibly important story to tell. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank Black Lives Matter.
Yes, indeed. Well, listen, I'm going to bring this conversation to a close by saying this is the American Slave Coast. Go out and get it. If you can't get out to get it, get on Amazon and get it. We have a couple of copies at the church. If anybody out there would like to buy a copy or two from the church, we have those.
There's an audiobook.
It's on audiobook. You can listen to it. So there are all kinds of ways that you can access this material. It is vitally important right now. But listen, to all of you out there who have been following along, who've been listening, watching, I want to thank you for being a part of the conversation too. So let's say it, Black Lives Matter. And I hope you can get out and support Black Lives, support the protests in any way you can. But start doing the work, and you could
keep them going.
And keep them going.
The important thing about these protests is that they keep going.
Yep. Amen to all of that. But I think a significant part of our work is to undo some of the white supremacy that we've inherited, and a great way to do that is by reading The American Slave Coast. So anyway, thank you guys.